All right, folks, welcome and thank you for joining us for the webinar Mobilizing Employers, Parents, and Communities for K-12 Education, hosted by Public Agenda and generously supported by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. My name is Brian Science. I'm the Director of Communications at Public Agenda. In a few minutes, you're going to hear from panelists who will discuss their perspectives on the public education system, how schools are measuring up and preparing students for the workforce, and other related topics. Before we hear from them, I'd like to go over just a few details for the webinar. You'll notice that your phones and microphones are currently muted, so don't worry about background noise by you. If you're having any trouble hearing presenters or can't see the presentation, please use the chat function in your webinar toolbar to send a message, and we'll try and troubleshoot with you through chat. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, but you can enter your questions at any time by using the Q&A button in your webinar toolbar. When asking a question for a specific presenter, please address it to that person using their name so we know who to direct it to. And we'll try our best to answer all the questions in the final 15 minutes of the webinar, but if we don't, we'll try to address them in follow-up email. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone over to my colleague, David Schleifer, who is the Vice President and Director of Research at Public Agenda. David.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. My name is David Schleifer and I am the Director of Research at Public Agenda. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts research, public engagement, and communications. And we're grateful to the Hewlett Foundation for supporting this webinar and for supporting Public Agenda's research, and of course to our presenters for sharing their lessons and experiences with us today. So as I'm sure you all know, the landscape of K-12 education in the United States has shifted substantially in the past 10 years. Legislation like Race to the Top, the Every Student Succeeds Act, as well as the Common Core Standards have affected many students, teachers, administrators, and parents. But meanwhile, funding inequities persist, and so do race-based and income-based achievement gaps. So with these large-scale policy changes and the persistence of achievement gaps and inequities in mind, the Hewlett Foundation asked Public Agenda to step back and take stock of public perspectives on K-12 education. So my colleagues and I looked across dozens of surveys, and we also conducted a series of our own focus groups with employers. And last week, we released a report on our findings called Our Next Assignment, which you can find on the Public Agenda website and which we'll be sharing with all of you via email after the webinar. The report, Our Next Assignment, pulls together findings from a range of surveys in order to identify common ground and contradictions within and across various stakeholder groups on fundamental issues like the purpose of public education, what students should learn in school, and how to address some of the challenges that our schools face. In our webinar today, we wanted to bring together the perspectives of people who've been working to get employers, parents, and community members more involved in schools and in education policy. We also wanted to hear from an educator who's been working to create a teaching and learning environments that promote equity, personalization, authenticity, and collaboration for students as well as teachers. So I'm now going to turn things over to Neha Gohil from the Hewlett Foundation, who will be introducing our speakers.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to be on this call today. As David mentioned, Hewlett was interested in where the national conversation is around education, given everything that's happened over the last decade. Our emphasis is on teaching and learning that empowers and equips students to achieve their own measures of success. And we understand that the conversation happening nationally around education needs to be broadened to bring diverse voices and new stories into this mix. So we funded this report in part to understand where people are starting that conversation, what negative narratives are getting in the way, and which provide some opportunities for us, especially as communicators, to understand where to start these conversations with folks. And what I'm hoping is that today's panelists will help bring that to life for us a little bit. We have three folks on the line with us today, and I'm excited to have all three of them here. There's Yusela Arisa, who's a senior education policy analyst at the Leadership Conference Education Fund. We have Susan Bonilla, who's the State Director in California for Council for a Strong America and Ready Nation. And then we have Paul, and both Gisela and Susan speak with some policy experience, but also very particularly around sort of community conversations in Gisela's case, and in Susan's case with an employer approach. And then we have Paul Yuma, who's at High Tech High, where he's an educator. And I will pass it along to Brian from here.
Great, thanks, Neha. So as you mentioned, our first presenter is Gisela Risa. Gisela currently serves as Senior Education Policy Analyst for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and Leadership Conference Education Fund. Her primary role includes supporting state partners in the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act to ensure strong state plans that drive towards education equity. She regularly engages state partners on federal policy and advises them on how to effectively advocate for educational equity and for civil rights protections for students of color, English learners, girls, LGBTQ youth, and students with disabilities. Prior to this, Gisela worked at the College Board as a Government Relations and Policy Associate. In addition, she served as an educational counselor to the Educational Opportunity Center. Before the College Board, Gisela worked as a policy analyst for the National Education Association. Gisela received a BA in Sociology from California State University, Northridge, and she completed her master's degree in Education and School Counseling from the University of Southern California. Gisela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Public Agenda and the Hewlett Foundation for inviting our organization to participate in this conversation. The Leadership Conference Education Fund aims to build public will for laws and policies that promote and protect the civil and human rights of every person in the United States. We were founded in 1969 as the education and research arm of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's premier civil and human rights coalition of more than 200 national organizations. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to briefly talk about an annual national poll we conducted the past 2 years to help us better understand what Black and Latino parents and families think about the American education system. I'm going to talk about a program we piloted this past year focused on training parents of color to be advocates for their children. And finally, I will provide some recommendations for engaging communities of color in education. Next slide, please. So our annual New Education Majority National Poll explores how Black and Latino parents and families view the American education system's success in educating their children. From our perspective, so much of public polling and opinion research is framed from the context of white parents and white communities, so we felt that it was imperative to gather this type of data to help provide for a fuller and more inclusive conversation around education. Our organization strongly believes that in order for any education policy changes to be truly reflective of what Black and Latino parents and families want, it must be responsive to the needs of the children who make up a majority of public school students in America. Unfortunately, due to funding constraints, we were not able to poll Native American and Asian American parents and families, but wanted to flag that we believe their perspective is just as critical, and we hope to be able to do that in the future. Next slide, please. So after polling, 1,200 Black and Latino parents, here is what we found. Black and Latino parents are extremely concerned about the racial inequality in schools across America. And increasingly, they are concerned about the quality of education their children receive in comparison to white children. Black and Latino parents really care that their children receive a high quality education, and they want their children to be challenged academically. That was a big part of what we heard in our poll. Next slide, please. 50% of Black parents and families believe that U.S. public schools are not doing a good job at preparing Black children for success. This is different, slightly different from what Latino parents and families reported, and we believe that this may be due in part to the longer history of racism and oppression against Black communities in America. Next slide, please. Overall, Black and Latino parents prioritize fair treatment for students regardless of their background. Again, they also identified school funding and strong academics and resources as a priority. They want to ensure that there are enough books and materials for each student, that their children have access to computers and technology in schools, and that they have access to challenging courses again, especially AP classes. It's also worth mentioning that our parents identified vocational classes like auto mechanics, culinary arts, cosmetology, and construction as lower priorities. Next slide, please. So we know from our research that most Black and Latino parents believe they have the power to change their schools, and so we seek to empower them with these tools. So shortly after the poll, our team realized that there was a need and a desire for more information. So this past year, we launched a program called Parent Advocates, specifically designed to help give parents of color the tools that they need to be better advocates for their children. Next slide, please. So the curriculum includes things like a history of civil rights in education, understanding the education system, including the local, state, and federal role in education. And what we've learned in the last few months is that parents receiving the training are absolutely hungry for information. And one of the modules that was the most popular is the Know Your Rights part. And that was really interesting for us. And so we're hoping to be able to, in the next couple of months, expand a little bit more in that area. You know, the parents were given small stipends to participate in the program. And of course, we also made sure that child care services were offered to the parents. You know, as we sort of move into a second year of offering this training, we're sort of piloting with just a small number of our state partners. We're hoping to be able to just get a better sense of, you know, what is happening on the ground and what are the additional needs that parents have. Next slide, please. So our, next slide, please, thank you. So our recommendations for policymakers, schools, and districts is to include parents of color and families in the decision-making process from the beginning. Currently, this opportunity exists through the federal requirement for parent engagement and the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. So it's going to be, you know, especially important to ensure that Black and Latino parents are engaged and consulted in the development and implementation of state, district, and school plans. And especially making sure that these communities are represented in state parent advisory groups and committees. And if states and districts and schools really want to address these inequities in education, then they really, really need to begin by engaging the communities of color, because these are the communities that are experiencing disparities disproportionately. Another recommendation is to remedy resource disparities. So addressing the long-standing disparities in resources between schools and districts with more Black and Latino children and those with more white children. And ensure, you know, access to strong teachers. So integrate implicit bias and cultural responsiveness training into teacher preparation and professional development to ensure that every educator is committed to the success of Black and Latino children. And again, you know, rigorous courses that just kept coming up in sort of some of the research that we found. So that means, you know, removing the barriers to participation and success in advanced courses for these children. And finally, identify, support, and improve schools. So make sure that schools have the support they need to overcome historical barriers that students of color have experienced. Next slide, please. So these are the two resources that you can visit. Again, the New Education Majority Poll has just pages and pages and pages with all of the questions, fact sheets, and all of the information that I cannot give you in the very short amount of time that I have, but also the Guide for Advocates was a very handy resource that we've used with a lot of our parent advocates, and it has tons of recommendations for parents and for small local organizations that are working with parents specifically. And next slide, please. And of course, here is my contact information. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Isel. I really appreciate it. Our next presenter is Susan Benia. Susan joined Council for a Strong America in 2017, and she brings nearly 20 years of education and policy experience to the organization. Prior to becoming the state director in California, she served as the California Assemblywoman of Concord, and much of her work in the state legislature focused on the educational, health, and welfare needs of children and families, with special emphasis on high-quality early childhood care, STEM, and revitalizing public education. She also led legislative efforts to reform the K-12 funding formula and eliminate fill-in-the-bubble testing in favor of computer-adapted assessments in order to ensure student success and workforce readiness in California. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brian and David, for your report and the focus that it brings to both the frustrations of and the recommendations from business leaders who want to have a positive impact on public education. And I also want to thank the Hewlett Foundation for your support of this important report and topic, and support of a report I'll mention that we were able to do, and I'll have that later in the presentation. Next slide. And the next one, that's just my introduction. Thank you. We really do believe that business leaders can have an impact, and we understand their frustration when they look at the workforce needs that they have, and then they look at public education. Ready Nation, which is one of the organizations within Council for a Strong America, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan volunteer membership organization of business leaders. And we really have a belief in a unifying goal of building a skilled workforce by promoting solutions that prepare children to succeed in education, work, and life. What's interesting about the work that we do with Council for a Strong America is we have Ready Nation, our business leaders, but we're also able to coordinate with our other leaders. We have organized law enforcement leaders, athletes, faith leaders, for maximum cross-sector impact, all on behalf of helping children achieve better opportunities and better outcomes in life. Our work is supported by foundations and other donors who really see the value of facilitating and organizing and mobilizing these cross-sector leaders on specific issues that will improve opportunities for children. Next slide. We have a great number, thousands of business leaders really across the nation. One of our Ready Nation members gave this quote: "Investing in children and youth is the social, moral, and economic imperative of our time." And that was John Pepper, former CEO of Procter & Gamble. We believe that our business leaders are able to add another dimension to the discussion of what solutions are needed. Our leaders use evidence-based data to make the case to policymakers of the wisdom in investing in children. It's really important, we believe, for business leaders to stay engaged, but we know that being effective and actually seeing change happen can be really frustrating, and business leaders have a lot on their plate already. Next slide. So, well, what can help make this transition from frustration to solutions? What if you're not Bill Gates or Rex Tillerson from ExxonMobil days? And what we have really found that for business leaders, it is organizing that makes all the difference. As it says there, business leaders already have a job. They are looking at their bottom line, and there are a lot of different things that they're trying to take care of. And so we really believe that organizing works, just as community organizing works to bring people together for more impact. We believe that our community organizing of business leaders is really an effective way to work for educational change, because we know that educational change is time intensive, it requires strategy, it's a long-term commitment. And we also believe that organizing business leaders and inviting them to join organizations that focus on educational issues for children really allows them to be part of a larger system change that needs to happen within public education. Next slide. So business leaders, we believe, have a unique platform that they can use to work on changes in their local schools, but then also at the system-wide state level. And individually, that would be very hard to accomplish. And I think that's where the value of various organizations that are really focused on giving the time to organizing is helpful. Here you see a list of some of Ready Nation's actions that we support our membership, who are all volunteer, in pursuing, from connecting with policymakers on investments in educations to giving presentations, to helping to elevate the message, to giving information to their sphere of influence on how important some of these changes are, and also educating their own employee workforce, and of course supporting local programs as well. We believe that there really is gains from this kind of focused and strategic organizing of business leaders. Not only will their needs be met for a stronger workforce and the personal benefits to our young people as well, but it also decreases at the same time the very costly and socially devastating downside of failing to close the achievement gap. Next slide. We also believe that an evidence-based approach is very important. Everyone is familiar with how education fads come and go. Using data to direct towards effective solutions, I believe, is something that business leaders can embrace and have full confidence in getting behind evidence-based solutions. But we feel that one of the main focuses that is important, and I've listed some here that business leaders can have an effect on, is really teaching students how to learn, how to become problem solvers, critical thinkers who can work collaboratively with others. Next slide. So here you have the problem that we hear a lot. Students need to have improved critical thinking, problem solving, and computational skills. And so how are we going to mobilize? I wanted to give you a quick example, and on the next slide you'll see in California we have quite a challenge. 6.2 million students in K-12, and we need to deepen all of their learning. We were very excited that Hewlett supported us in a report that we were able to put into the hands of our members to help mobilize them once we've organized them to go out with this message. How are we going to do it? What's the solution? Well, California has had some breakthroughs with new computer science education standards just this September, and also a plan for how are we going to implement this for 6.2 million kids. And it's really important and critical to have that business support and those leaders' voices speaking out to get this done at the scale that it needs to be accomplished in California. Next slide. This is just an example of showing you what one of the standards is. We talk about them all the time, and if you have a moment to read this, it's really interesting to see how a kindergarten student can begin to do an algorithm and programming just with even ordering storyboard sequences, which also fits the language arts standards. And then there's another example on the right-hand side of the slide of how these can be integrated into what is already being taught. And we want to emphasize that we're really not promoting just the use of technology or teaching keyboarding, but rather, again, the thinking skills. And a major challenge we know is equity, that we need to do this statewide, or otherwise our achievement gaps will actually grow even wider over the next decade with serious consequences, not just for the students, but for our society and our economy. Next slide. So here we look at a list of kind of how we put together, how are we going to mobilize our business leaders. So we partnered for a forum that we called Closing the Computer Skills Gap for All Students. We had an elected assembly member who convened the forum. We had the superintendent, school board members, teachers, business leaders, nonprofits, philanthropies, military leaders, all come together to really talk about the urgency, talk about what we want to prioritize, increase the number of stakeholders, build momentum, and include the community and others in the education field. Next slide. Here's a quick picture where we have our panelists, teachers, military leaders, business leaders, all together for this panel that we did with a really good public turnout. Next slide. We have unexpected allies. I said we had a retired admiral. Some people don't think the military would come out and start speaking about why education is so important, but poorly prepared young people actually becomes a national security concern. Also, national security is very involved in the economy of every state of the nation practically, with a huge impact here in California, not only through their spending, but through the jobs they create. And they're looking for that same talented workforce of good thinkers. So we have found blending the voices from cross sectors, these partnerships become very powerful to deliver the message of what the solution can be. Next slide. So we believe business leaders have an integral role to play in improving education. And we believe it's truly good for business for them to stay engaged in challenging public education to continuously improve. Next slide. So our recommendations are, first of all, for the business community, create a family-friendly work environment that gives the children of your employees the best start by helping their parents be strong parents and the good first teachers that the children will have. Secondly, increase your impact by becoming organized. Join an organization focused on education improvements. Then be mobilized. Maybe that's just signing a letter or writing an op-ed to your newspaper, but be mobilized and form these cross-sector partnerships that will bring change. And then finally, be a voice for the children who do not have an advocate, and know that you're making a difference in the lives of many children who aren't going to have a voice without you, but that as a business leader, you can use your position and your influence to make significant improvements in their lives. Next slide. Just want to thank you. And again, here's my contact information. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks again.
Susan, thanks so much for the unique and helpful perspective. Our next presenter is Paul Yuma. Paul is a current New School Creation Fellow pursuing his Master's in Educational Leadership from the HTH Graduate School of Education. Alongside community stakeholders and coalition partners, Paul and his team are undergoing a process of co-creating a community charter school rooted in Southwest Denver. Prior to this, after joining the Teach for America Colorado Corps, he was a founding 8th grade teacher at the DSST College View. And Paul also served as an Aulas Sin Fronteras exchange teacher, working closely with teachers and students from Zaragoza, Mexico. He founded the Moxie Collective in the spring of 2017, born out of the demand for authentic school choice and a reimagined vision for what college and career readiness could look like for a community. Paul was born in Cuenca, Ecuador, and moved to the U.S. when he was 4 years old. He grew up undocumented as a former DACA recipient and son of 2 Ecuadorian immigrants. He graduated with a degree in English literature from the University of Connecticut in 2014. Paul.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Public Agenda for having me. It is a privilege and a gift to be able to build coalition with all these partners and community stakeholders in our work. I'd love to give a little bit of the educator perspective on K-12 public education and share a little bit about some of the key findings that the Moxie Collective has undergone through our community organizing principles that have kind of led our work in the last 2 years. So one big topic that I think is really interesting going on in education circles today, and I think specifically at High Tech High, where I am a acting 11th grade dean of students, is this notion around these two worlds for learning for our students. The one being a emphasis on socio-emotional development and having our students feel loved and known, and having tools and skills of empowerment in place to have our young people take their rightful place in this world. And then there's this other learning world where students are performing academically, they are excelling with their test scores, but might not have that socio-emotional focus. These schools are commonly known as zero tolerance, high expectation, no nonsense sort of schools. And something that was brought up at the birth of the Moxie Collective was this question around, well, where is that middle ground? Does that exist? Can we have the best of both of these worlds? And that is something that we kind of led with in our work at the Moxie Collective. So as was mentioned, I am currently a New School Creation Fellow, looking to adapt and reimagine the project-based learning focus here at High Tech High to the community that I am co-creating a school with in Southwest Denver. So we've had about 23 community design meetings with educators, local community stakeholders, local business owners, families, and students. And the question was around how do we design for justice and liberation for our student community? And a couple of solutions were brought to the table, co-creating with and for community stakeholders. So parents and families in Southwest Denver, where the demographics are largely Latinx, Chicano, Thai and Vietnamese families, really wanted a personal stake in a community school. So knowing that, how do we make that school a hub for that community? We were really enthralled by the co-creation method and have since been eliciting student responses and family responses around how do we co-create with and for and not onto a community. The second finding that was brought up in these community design meetings are how do we leverage the strengths located within our local ecosystem? So knowing Southwest Denver, what are the structures and systems in place within that community that we can leverage to best lift the voices of our students and families in an educational space. The third thing that we did about a year and a half ago was piloting to test our assumptions. Some of our assumptions being, can we create a alternative form of learning that is non-Eurocentric, that is a counter-narrative to what has been presented in schools, that has a decolonization focus for our youth in Southwest Denver is something that we are emphasizing and have been testing throughout 3 middle schools and 2 high schools in the Denver area. And the fourth was parent education workshops to bridge access, because something that was noted throughout my previous school where I worked at was that there was this bridge, and some of the presenters have mentioned this before, that parents want to have that agency to be able to affect discipline structures and policy at the school level. So how do we make that accessible for all parents from all backgrounds to champion their own unique causes and their own unique vision for what learning could be like, not only for their respective child, but for students within that community in general. So that is something that we have really been focusing on, especially when we try to bring this vision of a indigenized education along with a decolonized curriculum. As a first-generation immigrant and a first-generation college graduate, I know that that is something to unpack with families. My parents would not have wanted me to attend the school that has this decolonization aspect due to the pressure to assimilate and go to those metrics of success that have largely been in place by dominant culture. So we've had to do a lot of parent education workshops on what is historical oppression within that neighborhood, within that community, within Denver, and within this country at large. Some of the key findings that we've had as we elicit family and student responses are that families have identified a lack of authentic school choice. And this is something that educators have voiced as well, knowing that in Southwest Denver in particular, parents and families can choose a really strict, no-nonsense type of school that is producing really great test scores and has students excelling with academic gains, or a failing public school. So there was no option C for these families, which is where the Moxie Collective came in. And we're really trying to bridge the gap between these two worlds to have a social justice, holistic environment within our school, but also have these strong academic gains and content mastery through our unique vision for curriculum and learning within our space. Parents have also stated that it is not as comfortable to access a school where they do not see themselves reflected in the administrative team or leadership team, or even in the teacher makeup. So we've been really intentional from listening to educators, specifically educators of color, what would it mean to have a sustainable atmosphere, environment within a school, so there isn't that teacher burnout, which is accelerated for teachers of color today in general. And some of the things that were brought up from these educators were making sure that we have intact this diversity and inclusion notion, but also center justice and equity in more palpable ways. So asking questions like, instead of who's in the room, but who's trying to get in the room but can't, and whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure. Asking questions like whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority, and then having educators wrestle with questions along what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as a perpetual majority within schools, which is a whole another issue that we are trying to tackle in terms of having leaders and educators of color within our unique community in Southwest Denver. And that is something that brings us to students verbalizing a desire and demand for a transformative education grounded in project-based learning and in the real world. So our pilots have involved creating urban gardens with our students, have created murals that really showcase the beauty of the Southwest Denver neighborhood. And we've really been able to see how we can posit these community issues and community problems and have our students' projects be a reflective and solutions-based approach and process for that learning. Next slide, please. So these are a couple of images from some of the pilots that we have done. We, along with a team of really skilled educators, have partnered with Teaching Tolerance to match our Common Core state standards with the social justice standards, which have a flow of identity, diversity, justice, and action, where our students can undergo really what I would consider not only meaningful, but authentic experiences that are rigorous and based in real world competencies. So doing a lot of identity work, story of self, building your personal narrative, and then being able to unpack and learn from other people's diversity, other people's identity, other cultures, translating that into justice-focused projects, justice-focused learning, to be able to pick apart what is just, what is unjust through a historical approach, and then action, writing letters to public officials, elected officials, doing a mural, doing some sort of tangible artifact that can bring on a powerful notion for students and speak truth to power in that regard. Like I mentioned, these standards also align with our communal liberation and educational praxis, which is at the heart of what we are trying to do here at the Moxie Collective. Parent outreach to unpack project-based learning and a decolonizing education. So again, we have been piloting with a couple of local nonprofits and local groups what we are going to say to our parents that helps bridge that access as well. Redefining and reimagining college and career readiness for our community. So how do we tackle these notions of success that have largely been whitewashed and rooted in heavy assimilation for our community? And how do we bring that to the table and help unpack it and bring all the options to the table and kind of get rid of some of that stigma? Our solution is to provide students with a culturally relevant, engaging, and responsive education that is rooted in these principles. And students have verbalized a desire and demand for a transformative education, like I was mentioning earlier. So that is something that we really hope to ground in our principles as we continue to move forward and bring about a new sort of community school in Denver. And you can check out our website at themoxiecollective.org, where our information is there to contact us as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. Really appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and open it up to Q&A. We have a few questions here for various presenters. It looks like the first one, Susan, is for you. The question is, you've been a teacher, a policymaker, and have worked with employers. How can employers find ways to get involved in schools and in education that don't leave educators in schools feeling attacked or burdened, but that can actually position educators in schools to grow and change in positive ways?
Well, I think part of that is about the relationships, because I'm very sensitive to the attack issue. I was a former high school English teacher myself, and I think that it's about educating business leaders and moving them from that point of frustration, which usually generates the attack, to a solution, to an answer that can be achieved. But the only effective answer or solution in education is going to be one that includes the teachers and the parents, and hopefully even the students. So a part of the work here of organizing business leaders is definitely goes into that realm of the partnerships that you want to be working with.
Great, thanks, Susan. Another question, Gisela, in thinking about what you've learned in working with parents and communities, what kind of skills and mindsets do parents and communities need to get involved in schools and education in productive ways? And how can they develop these skills or mindsets?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we found from a lot of our research with Black and Latino parents is that, like, I mean, the mindset is already there, right? Like, they already know, they recognize, they understand that the American education system has been unfair, you know, and it's clear by a lot of the data that we see and how students of color are performing academically that you know, there's a lot of disparities that need to be addressed. I think that for parents, many times, especially, you know, if we have Latino parents that are non-English speakers, that it's hard for them to understand where to find this information. And so that is sort of what our goal was with our parent advocates training, was to give them an overview of how the education system works in the US, who are the decision makers within the school and the district level and at the state level, how to, you know, the types of issues that parents have. They have an opportunity to share and to share knowledge with other parents in similar situations. And so I think that much of the time is also giving them a list of organizations that can serve as resources for them. And so for us, it's been about connecting them to established organizations that have those relationships in the community, and that's a very big piece of this work.
Great, thank you. Paul, a question for you. A cynical person might question whether the type of co-creation with families and this innovative curriculum you're talking about is compatible with rigorous academic standards and college readiness. But clearly, that's not the case for you. Can you say more about how working with families and your curriculum actually goes hand in hand with rigorous academics and college prep?
Yeah, definitely. So something that we've found in our learnings is that it really helps to have our own students be able to unpack and pick apart what we're trying to do at the Moxie Collective to their parents. So something that we've done in the past is gone through a pretty heavy ideation process to have our students do a presentation of learning through their story of self, through their personal narratives, through some of the hard skills that they've shown and some of the texts that they've wrestled with, and have them present that to their parents. And we've actually done it in the past where we've had these sort of, you know, gallery walk style presentations without any names of any of our students. And then we've invited families that either are on the fence or maybe pushing back with our educational model. And then we've had some really beautiful moments where students have actually been able to say, oh, this is actually my project, and are able to unpack their learning with their parents. And I think, you know, as we're trying to do a rigorous match to what has been tried before with a sort of, you know, how do we cultivate this revolutionary love for our students while at the same time being realistic with the system that is currently propped up. We've had to have some really vulnerable, heavy conversations with our parents and students around what this means for this organization to be fully fleshed out, for this organization to have viable fiscal sponsorships and funding. And that really has had a look at systemic approaches for our work. And in terms of, you know, having a rigorous academic output, our students really have been able to tackle these questions on how do we create systems level change through some of the Colorado state standards, but also being able to essentially educate their parents on some of this work, and having, you know, leveraging local community partnerships to come in and facilitate some of that work as well, so that our parents aren't coming in at a, you know, zero approach in terms of like what we're trying to do or what historical oppression can look like in that community. So we start off with parents having a community workshop with an organization called Padres y Jóvenes Unidos. And then we have our students kind of showcase some of the work that they've been doing. And throughout that process, they are also able to unpack, this is what authentic learning is to me. And I think within our surveys for our pilots, we've seen a big increase in engagement and parents also recognizing, oh, I've never really seen my student this engaged in a project or a assignment. And we are aligning this to, you know, the need for a education that is of a counter narrative, essentially.
Great. That's great, Paul. Thank you very much. Yisel, I have another question for you. In the curriculum you developed for parents and community involved in schools, what have you learned about how to deal with some of the tricky power dynamics between educators and policymakers on hand and families and parents on the others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, one of the goals from this curriculum and this training for parents of color on the ground is to essentially give them an opportunity to, you know, to create or to establish a coalition, either with other like-minded parents in the school or like-minded parents in a district. And I think that one of the things that we've learned, again, is that once the parents have the information in terms of how the processes work, they already feel that they just need the knowledge and the understanding of who to take the information to. You know, certainly I think in conversations from some of the groups that I attended, specifically in Georgia, you know, this sort of came up in the context of parents that had children with disabilities. And, you know, in terms of like, they were very much aware of the rights that their children had, very much aware of the rights that they had as parents. And I think that that's why the Know Your Rights part of this curriculum spoke to so many of the parents, because that's just what the sort of what they needed to hear in order to feel empowered to then be able to approach the teachers and the principals in the school to tell them, hey, this is what I've learned. I know that you know, you are required to give me this information. And I think that our training gives them the tools. You know, they are able to have conversations with other parents, are able to begin sort of in coalition, begin identifying goals on specific things that they want to achieve. And in many ways at the beginning, they get to start figuring out like the root causes of specific problems in schools as well. So I think that, you know, there's a lot that we've learned. There's a lot more that we can do with this, and we're hoping to build off of that, of all of the work that we've done in the last year.
Great, thank you. Susan, for you, what have you learned from your experience with the California computer science standards about how to mobilize employers that you think the business communities and other states need to know in order to have the same success you had with other priorities in education?
Well, I think one important element is really to make sure everyone understands the length of time these big changes actually are going to take and have realistic expectations. When you're dealing with business leaders, they do understand being strategic. They understand that it's going to take a certain number of years to move an entire organization as complex as education in a different direction or in an improved direction. So I think that is a very important point to communicate anytime you're trying to organize, is to set reasonable expectations. The other thing I think that would be helpful and just around the computer science that's kind of interesting is that California's been lagging behind. So I think we're like now the 29th or 30th state to finally get computer education standards. Everyone thought, you know, California with, you know, Silicon Valley and tech, that we would have been out in front, and we've actually been behind. And so I would say that connecting with national organizations like code.org and other nonprofit organizations that are specifically focused on The details of what is involved in standards is very important. You know, from the business perspective, it's about finding those experts in that can do the job, and then allowing our business leaders to elevate their work and to really shine a spotlight on why this work that has been being done for many years is so important to actually get implemented. So I think they're going to have a larger role in the implementation because there's been a tremendous amount, years of work from those who actually understand computer science and have been, you know, doing all of the actual work of writing these standards and designing them, the educators who have been deeply invested. So it's also about bringing your business leaders in at the right time. They're really not interested in all the backstory, what's happening behind the curtain, but it's presenting them with something that is going to work. Now, another important function of it working, because a lot of business leaders, they don't want to be associated with a failing effort or a failed effort. So I think you have to have a reasonable level of confidence that it's going to go now. You know, we've been, why in California are we now confident when we were so far behind? Well, we're confident because one of the sponsors of the bill that established the implementation planning panel was Governor-elect Gavin Newsom when he was lieutenant governor. So one of the first steps, if you want to see something like this happen, is looking at who you have in positions of governmental leadership. And I'll tell you, nearly all the states that have been successful have governors who are right at the front, right at the point of championing this kind of change towards the integration of computer science education standards into the deeper learning for students.
Great, thanks, Susan. We have time for one more question. Paul, this one's for you. You were talking about the working with the community and parents. How have you worked with teachers to help them have the skills and competencies they need to implement the innovative curriculum you're developing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Something that we've been really fortunate is to have a really robust network of educators who have a clear alignment to our vision. So looking at workshops and conferences, aiming at both allies and teachers of color around this work has been really beneficial. So we've been really privileged to be able to send teachers to schools like High Tech High, to do school visits at Roses and Concrete Community School up in Oakland, to take and learn from a couple of the great schools that are already doing this work. And so we've been able to fund some school visits, which have been really great, which orient our prospective teachers into the work that we are trying to reimagine and then be inspired by, and at the same time constantly looking for some conferences and having a pretty robust resource guide on required readings and a couple of key documents that really align with our praxis to make sure that teachers know a little bit about some of the expectations and norms that we aim to have within our school, and making sure that there is iterations through those based on parent feedback and student feedback, and just making sure that there is a clear desire and intentionality to design for a justice-focused school. And the educators that we've been able to recruit so far are really aligned in making sure that they present a curriculum for us that they have been working on. And what we've found is often some of this work does exist in schools, and sometimes it does exist in these zero tolerance sort of charter schools, but these educators often operate in a silo. So we're really trying to see how we can break apart that island and have educators really collaborate in a way that has the whole school community aligning in this work, and not just having individual teachers doing it once a week, once a month, once a semester, but really kind of having this be a focal point of what our curriculum and learning experience could look like for Moxie students.
That's great, Paul, thanks. And that's all we have for questions. We are going to send an email either today or tomorrow that will provide a link to the recording of the webinar. It's also a copy of the slide deck and links that David and other panelists mentioned in their own presentations. Thank you again to everybody particularly the Hewlett Foundation. If you want to find any information about Public Agenda or Hewlett Foundation, here are the links on your screen there. Many thanks for our presenters, many thanks to Neha and the Hewlett Foundation for their support, and of course, thank you all for joining us. Take care.